Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so I'm going to summarize our math talk on solving quadratic equations with the zero properties. So it says, or with the zero product properties, what values of the variables make each equation true? So I'm going to think out loud here, and I have 6 plus 2 times a equals 0. Well, I know that 6 minus 6 equals 0. So I know that 2a has to equal negative 6. So if I divide both sides by 2 there, negative 6 divided by 2, I would get a equals negative 3. So that's kind of the math that I'm doing mentally to solve that. Now, the next problems are a little bit different. So I notice here that I have 7 times some number b equals 0. So I know that when I multiply two numbers and they equal 0, that one of them has to be 0. So I can just conclude here that b has to equal 0 because I know that 7 times 0 is 0. Similarly here, 7 times some number is going to equal 0. Well, I have to make c minus 5, and here's what I'm doing in my head. I'm saying c minus 5 equals 0, and then I'm plugging in, well, what number minus 5 is 0? I know that c is equal to 5. Same thing here. When I multiply two numbers to be 0, I know that g here has to be 0, or h has to be 0. Now, if I examine these number talk problems, I can kind of see that these three problems involve multiplying, and this problem involves adding, or addition and multiplication. So it's interesting in that we have adding opposites equals 0 and multiplying by 0 equals 0. So different properties. So this property, when you multiply something by 0, is called the zero product property. So for our next problem, we're going to take each problem and solve them. So as I look at these problems, I kind of think about them and I notice these problems involve additive inverses, or adding the opposites. And then these problems involve the zero product property because I'm multiplying two numbers to be 0. So let me just solve these. I know that some number minus 3 equals 0. Well, opposites, when I take a number and then subtract that, that gives me 0. So I know that x has to equal 3. Some people solve it a little bit more formally, though. So if I'm undoing subtracting 3, I can write that and add 3 to both sides of my equation. Negative 3 plus 3 makes 0, so I bring my x down. And 0 plus 3 is 3. So some people show that algebra, some people can do that more mentally. Whatever method works for you, do that. Same idea here. I know that some number plus 11 equals 0. Well, x has to be negative, and then I know that opposites will add to 0. So I can kind of do this and say x is going to equal negative 11. But I do want to make sure that I'm showing my work, so I can subtract 11 from both sides. And I would get x is equal to 0 minus 11 is negative 11. And again, 11 minus 11 makes 0. That's why that cancels out. Now here, we have a two-step equation. 2x plus 11 equals 0. So I subtract 11 on both sides. And then that makes 0, so I can bring my 2x down. 0 minus 11 is negative 11. And then 2 times x equals negative 11. Divide both sides by 2. And then negative 11 divided by 2 is x equals negative, and then I'm going to express that as a decimal, 5.5. So if you notice, these ones were additive opposites. So now here we're going to do multiplying and using the zero product property. So if I'm multiplying two numbers and get 0, I can set both equations equal to 0. So these are the two factors, and they're two separate factors. So I'm going to set them equal to 0. So I know that x equals 0, and that equation is solved. That's one possible answer. And then we have 2x plus 11 equals 0. And I could solve this formally, but I noticed that I did that work up here. So I'm just going to say we solved that. X equals negative 5.5. So we have two possible answers here. Same idea here. We have two factors that are equal to 0. So I know that this factor, x minus 3, could equal 0. And that this factor, x plus 11, could equal 0. I notice that we did that work up here. So I know that x equals 3. And then similarly up here, we already did x plus 11 and solved and got x equals negative 11. So I have my two possible answers. And then for number 6, same idea. X minus 3 is equal to 0, and 2x plus 11 is equal to 0. And then we did the work. So we know that x equals 3. And then same thing here. We solved that x equals negative 5.5. And don't be afraid if you showed your extra work. I used to do that as a student all the time. So we found the solutions and we showed our work on both parts. So up here, when we solved addition problems, these are linear and had only one solution. These problems are quadratic equations in factored forms and have two solutions. So now we're going to revisit the quadratic equation, or the projectile motion equation, so that we've seen some quadratic functions modeling the height of projectile motion as a function of time. Here are two ways to define the same function that approximates the height of a projectile in meters. So I see that one variable is height, and I'm going to put that, and then I'm going to put in m for meters. And then our other variable is t seconds, so it's time, and that's measured in seconds. So h of t stands for height, and then that's negative 5t squared plus 27t plus 18. That, as a review, is standard form. And then this equation was factored over here and is put in factored form. So which way of defining the function allows us to use the zero property to find out when the height is 0 meters? Well, we can use the factored form equation and set h of t equal to 0. So using h of t equals negative 5t minus 3 times t minus 6. So we set h of t equal to 0 and solve using the zero product property. So now without graphing, solve. So set h of t equal to 0. So 0 equals negative 5t minus 3 times t minus 6. And then set both equations equal to 0. So I'm going to say negative 5t minus 3 equals 0, and t minus 6 equals 0. And then to solve both equations, I'm going to show my work by working backwards. So I'm going to get rid of the minus 3 first by adding 3 to both sides. Negative 3 plus 3 makes 0. So I bring negative 5t down. And on the right-hand side, 0 plus 3 is 3. And then I divide by -5 on both sides. And then I get t equals, so I'm going to change 3 divided by -5 into a decimal. And I get -0.6 seconds, which in terms of our math model, -0.6 seconds in the past doesn't make sense. So I'm going to look here and try to solve this equation, t minus 6 equals 0. You can see that I just add 6 to both sides, and t equals 6 seconds. So my solution, that 6 seconds, is going to be when my projectile is 0. So summarizing here, we have the zero product property, and it just says if you multiply two numbers, a product of two numbers just means multiply. One of the numbers must be 0. So if you're multiplying A times B and that equals 0, then either A is B or 0 or B is 0. So in using that, if we have an actual example of a quadratic function in factored form, m times in parentheses m plus 9 equals 0, you can set the two equations equal to 0 and say either m equals 0 or m plus 9 equals 0, and then that means 0 and -9 are solutions.